Now, you may have heard that the government can now borrow up to 2.5 trillion shillings from external parties after Parliament raised the debt ceiling from 1.2 trillion shillings. But just what does this mean, and what will the impact of this be? Adelaide Changole breaks down the numbers for us.
For every 100 shillings you pay in taxes today, about 3 shillings goes towards paying off debts and interest accrued on the 1.05 trillion shillings loans owed to external parties by the state. But this figure could rise significantly now that Parliament has more than doubled the country's external debt ceiling from 1.2 trillion shillings to 2.5 trillion shillings. Parliament approved the request from Treasury, ostensibly to give the state headroom to procure the finances needed to actualize its key infrastructure projects, which include the standard gauge railway, the Lapsset transport corridor, and the road expansion works, all of which need trillions of shillings.
We'll continue to accumulate external debt, but we wanted to make sure that this cap does not become an hindrance.
And analysts are lauding the move, saying the higher debt ceiling will allow the state to bridge the 2 trillion shilling infrastructure gap that exists in the Kenyan economy and allow the country to leapfrog past its neighbors and cement its place as the gateway into East Africa.
We need to improve our railways. We need to do the port at Lapsset. We want to be the, if you think of it like a transit state, we want everyone to pass through us. So I think there's general consensus around the plan.
Moreover, it will allow the government to borrow long-term debt at lower interest rates from the international financial markets while reducing its reliance on debt from the local market. And without the crowding out effect brought about by the government, the local interest rates should fall, which would be a boon to local businesses.
The more government stays out of domestic markets, you relieve pressure of interest rates and allow, you don't crowd out private investment.
But the new ceiling raises a critical concern about the debt levels. According to the International Monetary Fund, emerging and developing countries like Kenya should maintain debt at 40% of GDP. And while the rebasing of the economy shrunk the debt from 56 to 46% of GDP, it is still above the IMF rate and is likely to rise.
I think it's going to be tough to keep it down to 40. I think, over the next 2 or 3 years, we are going to be loading the balance sheet, and therefore I think it ticks higher, somewhere towards 60% potentially, before it starts coming down again.
More worryingly, according to the Exchequer report published by the National Treasury in September, the state overshot its budget for non-concessional commercial financing in the first 3 months of the fiscal year by a whopping 183%, borrowing 103.2 billion shillings against a full-year target of 36.43 billion shillings. Ironically, the state only borrowed 5.13 billion shillings from concessional sources against a target of 36 billion shillings.
We are taking on more expensive debt instruments, debt instruments which require to be paid immediately. At least there is no grace period for non-concessional loans. And that puts pressure both on government to raise revenue today, but also on the debt portfolio.
And this concern magnifies given the spate of borrowings already underway. In a submission before Parliament, Treasury Secretary Henry Rotich said the government had been assured of loans totaling more than $10 billion over the next 4 years. The state has also reopened the $2 billion Eurobond to raise an additional $750 million and plans to issue a Sharia-compliant Sukuk bond and a diaspora bond over the coming years. And now some analysts are questioning the sustainability of this new borrowing regime.
We are mortgaging our future, right? We are. This is a fact. We are borrowing money from people all over the world. If you look at who bought the Eurobond, North America 66%, the UK so we're borrowing money from these guys, and we're essentially giving them a kind of mortgage on our assets.
The government needs to clearly define for us the kind of debt management strategy that they are taking on.
However, the government insists the debt levels, even with a higher debt ceiling, are sustainable.
At the moment, our debt to GDP is well below 50%, and indeed, going over the medium term, based on the way that we see the fiscal framework, our fiscal policy developing over the next 3, 4, 5 years, we actually expect that debt stock in relation to GDP to decline over the next few years.
But Ali Kansachu says the concern should not be the debt to GDP levels, but rather how the funds being borrowed are utilized. And this, he says, is where the devil lies.
we're going to leverage our balance sheets. We've got to make sure we're investing and not just consuming or spending the money on salaries. I think that's the key issue.
Kenya's total external debt stock stands at 1.045 trillion shillings, representing 22% of the country's 4.757 trillion shilling economy. Adelaide Changole, KTN Business.